A red curtain falls, but not all truths stay hidden in the dark. Some voices return not with vengeance, but with grace. In this quiet tale of secrets, echoes, and final performances, justice is whispered, not shouted. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? What time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. Let's begin the story. The room behind the red curtain. The air in Boston felt a touch heavier than Jessica remembered, as though history lingered on the breeze. A taxi slid to a quiet stop in front of the Belmore Theatre, its marbled archway proudly bearing the name in faded gold script, the kind only time and nostalgia could soften. Jessica Fletcher stepped out with a small suitcase and the poised grace of someone both guest and observer. The theatre loomed like a slumbering relic, not yet roused, its velvet canopy worn but intact, like a matriarch who refused to admit to her age. Inside, the scent of dust and old wood mingled with faint perfume and something sharper, paint perhaps, or tension. It had been years since she'd seen Eleanor Bryce, but the woman who emerged from the wings to greet her bore a remarkable resemblance to the bright student Jessica once mentored. Yet there was a tightness around Eleanor's eyes, the kind that spoke not of age, but of burden. Jessica. Eleanor embraced her with warmth, but there was a pause too long before the smile returned to her lips. Jessica offered hers more gently. It's been far too long. They moved through the corridors, past faded posters and actors' names etched in brass, as Eleanor spoke of rehearsals and cast tensions. The revival of the Red Orchid was meant to breathe new life into the old theatre, but Eleanor's voice faltered each time she mentioned Charles Avedon, the director. "You'll meet him soon enough," she said lightly. "But he's difficult. Brilliant, of course, but difficult." Jessica simply nodded, but something stirred quietly inside her, not suspicion, not yet. Just the feeling that the past here hadn't been entirely forgotten. As Eleanor gave her the brief tour of the backstage area, Jessica's attention was drawn not only to the elegant decay of the theatre's bones, but to its silences. There was something about the corners that seemed to listen. "This theatre," Eleanor said with a tired chuckle, "has more ghosts than patrons most nights." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "The metaphorical kind, I assume." "Well, mostly." Eleanor stopped at the foot of a narrow stairwell leading to the upper dressing rooms. "There's one room behind the red curtain. No one uses it anymore. It's supposed to be bad luck." Jessica's gaze followed the line of old carpeting up the stairs. "And does anyone know why?" "Depends on who you ask," Eleanor murmured. "Some say a woman disappeared there. Others say it's just superstition. But everyone gives it a wide berth." That particular hallway remained unlit, despite the rest of the backstage glowing with life. Jessica noticed how the red curtain at the top, the one that supposedly sealed off the forgotten room, seemed to quiver, though no one had passed it. "Is that a draft?" Jessica asked gently. Eleanor hesitated. "Could be." They moved on, but Jessica glanced back once more. Not fearfully, just curiously. She'd spent enough time around myths to know that behind every superstition, there was often a wound, sometimes old, sometimes still open. That evening, after a long day of rehearsals and brief introductions to the cast, Jessica lingered backstage as Eleanor changed out of costume. When she returned, Eleanor held something in her hands, a bouquet of deep red orchids, rich and lush, bound with a black ribbon. Jessica tilted her head. "Those are beautiful." Eleanor didn't smile. "They were in my dressing room." "No card." Jessica moved closer. "Red orchids, weren't they your mother's favorite?" Eleanor's fingers tightened around the stems. "Yes, and they're part of the final scene in The Red Orchid." Her voice was careful now, not theatrical, personal. "I didn't tell anyone that." Jessica examined the bouquet more closely. The ribbon was freshly tied, the flowers crisp and cold to the touch, recently delivered. But there was something almost too perfect about them, as though selected for effect, not affection. Could someone be playing a joke? Jessica asked. Eleanor's face paled slightly. If it is, it's not funny. Jessica said nothing more, but her mind stirred. Orchids were delicate, precise things. A thoughtful gift, or a message. She knew gestures could speak louder than words, and this one had come from silence. Later that night, in her journal, she made a quiet note. Find florist. No card, no fingerprints. The bouquet sat in a vase on Eleanor's vanity. Its fragrance filled the room, but not comfortingly. Jessica felt it prick at the edges of something not yet known. The following morning Jessica wandered backstage while the cast rehearsed. Among the pinboards of notes and stage cues, an old photograph caught her eye. A black and white headshot, yellowing at the corners. A young woman smiled out from it, eyes framed by soft curls and heavy mascara. But someone had circled her eyes in ink, not neatly, twice, 3 times, as though underlining something unspoken. It wasn't done in malice, she sensed, but desperation. Jessica leaned in, studying the photo. It wasn't dated, no name attached. Who is she? She asked a passing assistant. The girl shrugged. No idea. Been there since before I got here. Nobody ever takes it down. Jessica filed it away in memory. The theater remembered what others forgot, and if someone had tried to erase her, they hadn't succeeded. Later that afternoon, Jessica took a quiet walk through the chilly Boston streets to the nearest florist. The red orchids had been distinctive, and the florist's wrapping paper, still folded inside the ribbon, bore the name Whitcomb's Bloomery. A young man at the counter looked up as she entered, helping with the theater again. Jessica offered a small smile. Just a guest this time. I'm curious about a delivery made yesterday. Red orchids, no card. He checked the order book, then frowned. It was paid in cash. No name left. That's unusual for us. Did the customer say who they were buying for? The man hesitated, said it was for someone special. That's all. Jessica thanked him, and turned to leave, her thoughts quietly turning inward. Orchids, chosen carefully, paid in cash, with no desire for recognition, or perhaps with every desire for secrecy. She walked back to the theater slower than before, watching the shadows stretch along the sidewalk like velvet curtains pulling closed. Someone wanted to send a message, and Jessica Fletcher was listening. Jessica sat in the 5th row, slightly to the left of center, the kind of seat a former English teacher would naturally choose, equal parts observant and respectful. She had seen the first act of The Red Orchid the evening prior, and while the script leaned heavily on melodrama, tonight's performance already felt sharper, the cast taut with a certain restless energy. Perhaps opening jitters had worn off, or perhaps something else had settled over them. Eleanor moved across the stage with quiet conviction, dressed in a dark velvet gown that shimmered under the footlights. Her voice rang steady, but Jessica noted how her eyes flitted once, just once, toward the wings stage right. A brief pause, a skipped beat in her next line, then recovery. Jessica's brow knit slightly. Then, during a shift between scenes, the moment where the second act set was being adjusted under dim blue light, there was a soft thud, not theatrical, real. A ripple passed through the stagehands like an invisible gust. Something was wrong. Jessica sat forward in her seat as murmurs rose from backstage. One of the actors missed their cue, a curtain failed to fall properly, and soon a figure, Thomas, the assistant director, rushed out from the wings and called out in a voice tight with panic, "Is there a doctor in the house?" Gasps spread through the audience. Jessica rose immediately. Backstage was a tangle of alarm. Cast members in partial costume hovered uncertainly near the red velvet curtain, now sagging slightly, one end askew. Just beyond it, Charles Avedon lay crumpled on the floor, unmoving, one arm flung out toward the set's velvet chaise. His skin had gone an unnatural shade, and a faintly sweet scent clung in the air, odd and out of place. Jessica crouched beside him. There was no pulse. Later, as she stepped back to allow the arriving EMTs through, Jessica's gaze returned to Eleanor. The actress stood off to the side, face pale, hands clasped together, and Jessica noticed again that same glance toward the side stage, but this time there was no acting in her fear. By morning, the theater's red door remained locked to the public, and a notice fluttered gently in the early breeze. "Tonight's performance has been cancelled." Jessica sat in the theater's modest green room, a paper cup of lukewarm coffee cooling in her hand. Across from her, Detective Paul Mencken, a compact man with thinning hair and a voice that always sounded vaguely irritated, flipped through his notepad. "Arsenic," he said plainly, "confirmed by the coroner this morning, delivered via one of the lozenges Avedon always kept in a silver case in his dressing room." Jessica nodded slowly. "He took them nightly. Every show night," Mencken confirmed, sore throat, according to his assistant. "Habit." The case was on his vanity. 5 lozenges inside, one clearly tampered with. The killer didn't try to hide it, just made sure he'd get the right one. Jessica thought of the faint sweetness in the air, that chemical whiff she'd picked up. It aligned. But something else tugged at her attention, the speed of the collapse, the public nature of the poisoning. She sipped the coffee absently. "It's a very theatrical way to die, wouldn't you say?" Mencken sighed. "They're all actors. Everything they do is theatrical." "Not everything," Jessica murmured. "Some things are buried under years of silence." The detective jotted something without comment. Jessica's mind drifted back to the day before, the envelope she'd found behind the backstage curtain, monogrammed and dusted with old powder. She hadn't shown it to anyone yet. It wasn't evidence, not quite, but it felt like something someone had meant to hide, not in panic, but in shame. "I'd like to speak to Eleanor Bryce," Jessica said softly. She seemed disturbed before it happened. Mencken shrugged. "She's on my list." Jessica folded her hands in her lap. She had a feeling this wasn't a murder born of rage or profit. It felt older, colder, a decision made long before opening night. And perhaps, she thought, this wasn't the first curtain that had fallen on someone's truth. Jessica waited until the late afternoon before stepping back into the hushed theater. The rehearsal room stood empty now, stripped of its usual laughter and ego, but voices, remembered or imagined, still seemed to hang in the air. She paused at the edge of the stage, letting her gaze travel to the chalk lines that marked where actors should pause, where words had once rung out sharp and rehearsed. Charles Avedon had stood here just 2 nights ago, his voice clipped, his direction bordering on cruel. "He wasn't well liked," came a voice behind her. Gloria Stanton, the theater's owner, approached quietly, clutching a folder of old notes. "I suppose that's not news." Jessica gave a small nod. "He demanded perfection. I imagine that didn't sit well with everyone." Gloria sighed. "He was brutal to Eleanor, told her she was too old for the role, that the play needed youth to survive." "Of course," he said it loud enough for the entire cast to hear. Jessica's memory stirred, Eleanor's pale expression during the curtain call, her trembling hands. "Did she ever fight back?" Jessica asked gently. Gloria hesitated, then offered a thin smile. Oh, she gave him a good piece of her mind. Said he didn't deserve to speak Leela May's name. That name again. Jessica tucked it away like a puzzle piece not yet placed. Charles seemed to enjoy pushing people, Gloria added. But the thing about theatre people, Jessica, we remember everything, even the things that are meant to be forgotten. Jessica let the silence settle before speaking. Sometimes the past doesn't like being forgotten. And in that stillness she couldn't help but wonder who had the deeper wound, the one insulted, or the one who had to listen from the shadows. Backstage had emptied by evening, leaving behind only the hollow hum of machinery and the scattered remnants of performance. Jessica walked slowly past the sets, her fingertips brushing against painted banisters and velvet drapery. The quiet was a comfort, a thinking space. She paused near the edge of the wings, where the red curtain had hung slightly askew the night before. Something glinted faintly beneath a wooden riser. She knelt, careful, and retrieved a small envelope, cream-colored, thick, with a faint blue monogram on the flap. K.A. Charles Avedon. She turned it over. The flap was unsealed, the paper inside gone. But there was something else. The faint shimmer of pressed powder at the edges, not the kind sold in drugstores, but the theatrical variety, finely milled and tinted for strong lights. Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly. Someone had held this in a hurry, possibly with powdered fingers, a dresser, an actress, or someone else entirely. She carried the envelope to the dressing rooms. Eleanor's was closed, the nameplate shining faintly in the dim hallway. Jessica didn't knock, not yet. Instead she studied the dressing room next door, which had belonged to Ruth Garvey, Eleanor's longtime dresser and companion. Jessica remembered Ruth from years past, loyal, soft-spoken, often overlooked. The powder could mean nothing, or everything. Why would someone remove a letter but leave the envelope? As Jessica turned the envelope in her hand, she noticed a faint indentation on the front, as though a fountain pen had pressed too hard beneath a name now erased. She traced the impression slowly with her thumb. It wasn't just theatre makeup clinging to this paper, it was memory, half scrubbed, but not yet gone. The next morning, Jessica returned to the Belmore Theatre to find Vincent Harrow brooding alone in the orchestra pit. The understudy had always lingered in the shadows, quietly rehearsing lines that might never be spoken aloud. He didn't look up when she approached. "You didn't perform last night," Jessica said gently. He gave a dry laugh. "No, Charles never let me. Told me I lacked texture. Whatever that means." Jessica noted the bitterness in his tone, not performative, but worn in, like a well-used costume. She took a seat nearby, folding her hands on her lap. "You were close enough to the dressing rooms," she said after a pause. "You could have accessed the lozenges." Vincent's jaw tensed. "You think I poisoned him?" "I think you were angry." He glanced up, eyes sharp. "Of course I was angry. I've been his understudy for 2 years. 2 years, Jessica, and he made it clear I'd never step foot on that stage." Jessica studied him carefully. "You had a motive, Vincent, but motive is only part of it." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you know what he was planning? He was going to cut the third act, gut the entire play, just so he could give the spotlight to someone else." "Someone else?" Vincent hesitated. "I don't know who, but I overheard him talking. Said it was time the theatre moved on from ghosts." Jessica's pulse flickered at that word. Vincent stood abruptly. "Believe what you like, but I didn't kill him." As he walked away, Jessica remained seated, thoughts spiraling. His anger was real, but it didn't quite line up with the calculated nature of the murder. Arsenic required planning, timing, subtlety. Vincent was volatile, but perhaps too direct. And sometimes, she reminded herself, the obvious suspect arrives too early. The detective had spent the morning interviewing cast members, stagehands, anyone who might have heard or seen something unusual. Jessica listened, smiled politely, but felt a growing sense of unease. They were asking the right questions, but perhaps not of the right people. She returned once more to the red curtain, its folds now stiff and still. It had once marked entrances and exits, on stage and off, but now it hung like a sentinel between truth and artifice. Jessica glanced back at the envelope, folded neatly in her handbag. What mattered wasn't what had been said aloud, it was what had remained unspoken. There was a rhythm to murder, she knew, one that moved not in sudden bursts but in slow, deliberate beats. This one hadn't been written in anger, it had been rehearsed. She walked away from the curtain slowly, her mind drawing the first outline of something deeper, and far more personal. The hum of activity had returned to the Belmore Theatre, but something beneath it had changed. A hush, a carefulness, like breath held between lines. Jessica made her way through the dressing rooms and narrow corridors with the easy grace of someone who belonged, though she kept mostly to the edges. It was in the small conversations, between makeup brushes and costume fittings, that she found her quiet clues. "Oh, he made her cry in front of everyone," murmured one of the chorus girls, her voice low as she pressed eyeliner to her reflection. "Said she was walking through the part like a sleepwalker." "He wasn't wrong," muttered another. "Eleanor's been distant for weeks, like she's acting through fog." Jessica tucked that thought away. She found herself beside a clothing rack heavy with brocade coats and lace. A stagehand, Robert, she believed his name was, paused as he passed. "Robert," she said kindly, "did you know Charles well?" He gave a short shrug. Knew his moods. That was enough. Jessica smiled faintly. Did those moods ever land on Eleanor? His pause was just long enough. They did, but she didn't always take it lying down. As he moved away, Jessica remained still. Something in his tone had been both protective and cautious. Protective of whom, though? Eleanor, or something unspoken? The theatre revealed itself in fragments. Jessica knew better than to demand clarity. She let the story come in pieces. A look too sharp, a word too late, a silence that didn't sit right. And it was in those silences that suspicion began to grow. It was in the props room that Jessica found Thomas, the assistant director, fiddling with a tangle of old light cords. He looked up, startled, when she entered. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said, setting the wires down with a faint wince. "You're looking for someone?" "I'm looking for something," she answered kindly. "Information." He gestured toward a folding chair, his expression wary. Jessica sat, folding her hands calmly. "I've heard whispers that Charles planned to cut the third act. Do you know if that's true?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "You hear everything in a theatre eventually. And yes, he was planning to cut it for the matinee version. Said the pacing was antiquated, that audiences didn't have the patience for long climaxes anymore." Jessica tilted her head. "Did Eleanor know?" "She wasn't supposed to, but I think she overheard." "Was she being replaced?" Thomas hesitated. "That, I don't know for sure. He'd been meeting with Sylvia Brooke, the girl playing her understudy. Alone, more than once." Jessica didn't need to ask more. She'd seen enough productions to recognize when a torch was being passed without ceremony. Did Sylvia seem aware of any shift in her prospects? Thomas sighed. She was suddenly very motivated, but Charles was careful, always careful. Jessica rose slowly, her mind already turning the pieces in quiet succession. To remove Eleanor from the final act would have rewritten not only the play's ending, but the personal story tied so deeply to it. She looked around the dim room, cluttered with discarded props and history. How many endings had Charles tried to rewrite? And how many ghosts refused to stay buried? The archives at the Belmore Theatre weren't exactly a formal affair, more a long-forgotten storeroom behind the lighting loft, where yellowed programs and cracked photographs lived in mismatched boxes. Jessica, with Eleanor's quiet permission, spent the better part of the afternoon sifting through the brittle memory of the building. Lila May. Her name had surfaced twice now, first in whispered lore, and again in the strange tension that seemed to follow Eleanor like a shadow. Jessica found an original program from the 1958 production of The Red Orchid. The cover was elegant, with silver lettering and a stylized flower motif. Inside, Lila's name appeared halfway down the cast list, but someone had carefully drawn a black line through it in ink. The handwriting, thin and precise, reminded Jessica of the envelope she still carried in her bag. She leaned closer. A margin note in pencil near Lila's name read, "Understudy to E.M." Jessica's brow furrowed. Eleanor's mother, Elizabeth Moore, had once performed here. But that connection between Elizabeth and Lila hadn't been mentioned before. She turned the page. A photo nearly unstuck from the binding fluttered loose. It showed a young woman in profile, her eyes cast downward, hair in soft waves. Jessica recognized her instantly from the marked photograph backstage. Lila May, always watching, always waiting. And beneath the image, scrawled in faded graphite, "Curtain must fall, even when truth doesn't." Jessica held the picture for a long moment, then gently tucked it into her notebook. There was a story here, one deliberately erased, and someone, she now believed, had gone to great lengths to make sure that story never made it back to the stage. Jessica found Eleanor seated quietly near the costume bins, her makeup half removed, the edge of a cotton cloth resting in her lap like a forgotten line. She looked up as Jessica approached, her expression unreadable. "I went through the archives," Jessica said gently. "Your mother, Elizabeth Moore, was Lila May's understudy." "I hadn't realized." Eleanor's eyes flickered, a barely perceptible shift. "She never talked about that time. Only once, years ago, when I asked how she got started. She said it wasn't her story to tell." Jessica sat beside her. "That must have been hard, carrying someone else's silence." There was a pause. Eleanor's voice softened. "Sometimes I think I was meant to play this part, that it's all been leading here. Lila disappeared, my mother vanished into obscurity, and now I'm repeating their scenes." Jessica studied her gently. "Repetition isn't destiny, Eleanor. Sometimes it's a call to stop the cycle." Eleanor looked down. "I've been having dreams of standing behind the red curtain, hearing applause that wasn't for me." Jessica remained quiet. In Eleanor's tone was something deeper than fear, grief perhaps, or guilt that had no clear shape yet. She touched Eleanor's hand briefly. "Sometimes the stage holds more than performance. It holds echoes, and in those echoes," Jessica thought, "someone had been hiding for far too long." Later that evening, Jessica returned to the copy of the 1958 playbill she had carefully tucked into her notebook. She studied the inked-out name once more, a black slash across the program that had clearly been applied with intent, not error. She held the page under a reading lamp in her suite and tilted it just so. The indentations beneath the blotched ink caught a glint. Slowly, using the side of a pencil and a piece of tracing paper, she rubbed gently. Letters began to emerge. E. Moore, Elizabeth Moore, Eleanor's mother. But why blot her name? Why hide her involvement? She turned to the script notes she'd also retrieved. Water-damaged, but still partially legible. The final act had been revised hastily, with entire passages struck out in red ink and new lines scribbled in the margins in a different hand. The original ending had involved a quiet confession, a final truth spoken before the curtain fell. The revised version cut that entirely. Jessica's eyes lingered on a margin note. Final scene too revealing. Shift focus to betrayal, not guilt. It wasn't a dramaturgical decision. It was erasure, not just of words but of someone's voice. Jessica leaned back. If Elizabeth had been the understudy, and Lila had vanished before opening night, it raised a possibility. Had Eleanor's mother stepped into a role, or into a life, never meant to be hers? And if so, whose story had truly ended that night in 1958? The red-curtained room was unlocked now, though rarely entered. Jessica stepped inside the forgotten space the next morning with quiet reverence. The air was still, as if sound had long ago given up trying to echo here. Dust settled like a fine veil over the room's contents: a wooden dressing table, an unused stool, an overhead light that buzzed softly but offered no warmth. Jessica's gaze drifted to the mirror. It stood tall, framed in ornate brass, its glass cracked diagonally across the reflection, not shattered, fractured, as though time itself had split down the center. She stepped closer. The mirror distorted her image slightly, placing shadows where none should be. But beneath the glass, something else caught her eye, a faint etching along the underside of the table's wooden lip. She bent to read it. LM, 1958. Still here. Jessica ran her fingertips across the letters, the carving done with something small but determined, a hairpin, perhaps, or a stage knife. The message wasn't grand, it was personal, quiet. A woman staking her presence in a space where her voice had been silenced. Her eyes moved back to the cracked mirror. In its reflection she noticed another detail barely visible behind her, a seam in the wallpaper near the far corner. She turned and walked to it. The seam wasn't a design flaw. It had been peeled back and carefully pressed again, like someone had looked behind it or hidden something there. She hesitated. Whatever had happened to Lila May wasn't theatrical. It wasn't legend. It was personal. And someone had tried very hard to preserve the myth while quietly burying the truth. Jessica returned to the lobby to find Gloria Stanton in the midst of a conversation with a young man in a sharp suit. He departed quickly as Jessica approached. "Jessica," Gloria said too brightly. "You're always catching me mid-chaos." Jessica offered a smile. "Busy morning," Gloria exhaled. "Let's say, complicated. Charles had promised an investor a cut of the ticket proceeds if the Red Orchid revived well. He kept the deal quiet." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "And now that he's gone, there's pressure to deliver," Gloria admitted. "The theater's in debt and this production was meant to pull us out." Jessica's gaze lingered on her. "You had a long history with Charles, didn't you?" Gloria's lips twitched. "Longer than I'd like to admit. He could charm when it suited him, and destroy just as easily. Did he ever threaten to change the terms of your agreement?" Gloria's pause was subtle, but present. "I thought about killing him," she said softly, in the way one imagines pushing a heavy vase off a shelf, "but I didn't. I couldn't." Jessica believed her, but something in her expression suggested she knew more than she'd said, and perhaps she'd made her investment not in money, but in silence. Jessica had always believed that the answers we seek often lie in the quiet corners. Others have long stopped searching, and so she found herself tucked into the far wing of the Boston Public Library, seated before a slim folder with yellowed edges marked Lila May 1958, inquest file. The file was thin, too thin for a woman whose death had been surrounded by whispers. Officially Lila May had died by suicide. She'd been discovered in the red-curtained dressing room the morning after opening night, slumped beside the vanity, a torn page clutched in her hand. No note, no family, no autopsy that raised questions, just a conclusion: grief, artistic temperament, an overdose. Jessica turned the page slowly. The report was clinical, detached, but one line stood out. Deceased was holding a torn diary page, content unreadable due to moisture damage. The diary had never been recovered, and Lila's name had quietly vanished from the production within a week. Jessica closed the file gently and sat back. The details didn't fit the theater's lore, the whispered curse, the vanished actress. Instead, the real story felt scrubbed, sanitized. If Lila had written something worth tearing from a diary in her final moments, it meant she hadn't planned to disappear in silence. Perhaps she hadn't planned to disappear at all. And someone, maybe more than one someone, had found it easier to let her fade, to sweep her memory under the rug of theatrical myth. Jessica rose with a thoughtful breath. She had found the record of Lila's death, but not, she sensed, the truth of it. Back at the theater, Jessica found Ruth Garvey, Eleanor's dresser, tidying the wardrobe shelves, carefully mending a frayed hem, with the sort of quiet devotion that came not from duty but from history. "Ruth," Jessica said gently, "do you remember Lila May?" Ruth didn't look up. Her fingers kept stitching, but her breath caught for just a moment. Enough. "I was a girl," she murmured. "But yes, everyone remembered Lila. She was kind, too kind for this place." Jessica waited. She trusted Charles, Ruth continued, her voice low. Believed he would make her a star, and he did, until he didn't. Jessica sat across from her. What happened? Ruth's hand stilled. He promised her the role, then rewrote half of it behind her back, gave her lines to someone else, said it was a better fit. She tried to speak up, threatened to go to the press. The next night, she was gone. Gone or dead? Jessica asked softly. Ruth met her eyes. "I don't think Lila took her own life, but after that night, no one wanted the truth. Not the theater, not the producers. Charles had too much to lose." Jessica nodded slowly. Charles Avedon hadn't just edited plays, he'd edited people. And Lila may have been his first major revision. Jessica returned to Eleanor's dressing room just before the evening's rehearsal. She found her friend sitting quietly at her vanity, staring at a folded scrap of paper in her hands. "They're not stopping," Eleanor said without turning. Jessica moved closer. The paper was typewritten, a line from the Red Orchid, but one Jessica hadn't heard in any recent version. "The roses are only red because they remember what was bled into them." "That's from the original version, isn't it?" Jessica asked. Eleanor nodded. "It was cut during the first production. I only know it because I found an old draft in my mother's things years ago." Jessica took the note gently. "You didn't write this?" "I didn't tell anyone about it," Eleanor whispered. "No one knew I had that script." Jessica felt a quiet chill move through her. The line had been sent with purpose, not as a threat, but a reminder. A message from someone who wanted the past remembered or revealed. "How many have you received?" she asked. "3 so far, each more personal than the last." Jessica turned the note over. The typewriter ink was slightly smudged at the edge. A shaky hand, or deliberate wear. "Someone's trying to resurrect a voice that was silenced," she said. Eleanor looked at her, eyes clouded. "Or haunt me with it." Jessica said nothing, but in her mind, something shifted. Someone knew too much about the lines that had been erased, and someone else might have killed to make sure they stayed that way. Jessica waited until the corridors had quieted, the echo of rehearsal notes fading into the background, of an aging building at rest. With a borrowed brass key from a hesitant stage manager, She slipped into the long forbidden dressing room behind the red curtain. The one whispered about, never claimed. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, the hush pressed in. The room was small, cloaked in dust. Its velvet drapes faded to the color of dried blood. The single mirror, clouded and cracked at the corner, hung above a narrow dressing table with its drawers half open, as though someone had left in haste, never to return. Jessica stepped lightly, letting her eyes adjust. The scent of thyme, stale powder, old perfume, and something vaguely metallic lingered like the breath of a ghost, too proud to weep. Nothing had been touched in years, and yet the atmosphere was not abandoned. It was suspended, as if Lila herself still waited for her cue. On the vanity lay a bobby pin, tarnished but deliberate in its placement. Jessica's fingers hovered over it, so small, so ordinary, but to a woman in this world, it was as essential as breath, and often used to hold more than just hair. She moved to the corner where the boards felt uneven beneath her feet, and paused. There was something beneath, something that had remained hidden, not out of carelessness, but out of choice. Kneeling with quiet purpose, Jessica pried at the lifted board with the edge of a nail file from her handbag, something she always carried for moments when gentle pressure was more effective than force. The wood groaned faintly as it gave way. Nestled in the small hollow beneath was a velvet pouch, mottled with time. Inside, wrapped with care, lay a gold locket, simple, worn. The clasp rusted slightly with age, but it opened easily. Inside, 2 miniature photographs faced one another. On the left, Lila May, younger than in any of the portraits Jessica had seen. She wore a wistful smile, as if posing in a moment between hope and hesitation. On the right, Charles Evadon. His expression was younger, gentler than the man he became, but unmistakably him. Jessica studied the images in silence, a keepsake, not a trophy, the kind lovers exchange in secret, or perhaps in hope. So, it hadn't only been betrayal on stage. Lila and Charles had shared something once, and if their bond soured, professionally, personally, it might explain the vehemence of her disappearance, and the quiet efficiency with which she was erased. Jessica held the locket in her palm. The intimacy of it was startling, even now. Not proof of murder, but a buried truth someone clearly didn't want found. She closed it gently. Whatever had happened in this room, it had not been theatrical. It had been heartbreak, and heartbreak, Jessica knew, had a long memory. Back in her room that evening, Jessica reopened the water-damaged 1957 script she'd taken from the archives, her thoughts still rooted in the locket's silent revelations. She turned to the final scene, letting her eyes wander across redacted lines, revised cues, and pages that had once held meaning, now crossed out, like unwanted memories. Then she saw it, scribbled faintly in pencil in the margin of the final page. Tell her before Act 2, or never again. The handwriting was rushed, looping, pressed so deeply into the page that it had left a faint indent on the sheet beneath. Not a stage note, not a cue, a warning, or perhaps a confession never spoken. Jessica read the line again, letting the weight of its ambiguity sink in. Tell her what? Tell Lila something, or tell Eleanor's mother. The words left room for both interpretation and regret. What if this wasn't about silencing a performer, but hiding a personal secret, a relationship, a child? Jessica's mind moved quickly but calmly. Legacy, shame, reputation. Murder doesn't always grow from hate. Sometimes it blooms from the fear of the truth rising after decades underground, and someone, it seemed, was still trying to bury it. The next morning, Jessica stood quietly in the rehearsal hall, where the cast had been summoned, not for rehearsal, but for clarity. The atmosphere was tense, threads pulled tight by days of silence and the lingering scent of suspicion. She began gently, not accusing, but inquiring. Charles of Eden's legacy, she said, is layered, both professionally and personally. I believe his past with Lila May wasn't simply theatrical, it was emotional and destructive. There were murmurs. Jessica's gaze settled on Gloria Stanton, the theater's owner. Gloria didn't flinch, but she didn't speak, either. Jessica stepped closer. Gloria, you were present during the original production in 1958, weren't you? Gloria's lips parted, slowly. I was a junior assistant back then, barely out of school. But yes, I was there. Lila threatened to go public, Jessica said, more gently now. She believed Charles sabotaged her performance and then erased her role from the play to elevate someone else. Gloria nodded. He was terrified it would ruin him. She said she had letters, journal entries, proof. What happened to them? Gloria looked away. No one ever found them, or said they didn't. Jessica tilted her head slightly. Did you see the body, Gloria? A beat. No, she admitted. By the time I got to the room, the coroner had already come. Charles was efficient. He said it was best not to dwell. There was something tired in Gloria's voice, a weariness that came from holding too much for too long. Jessica said nothing further. She had what she needed, not a confession, but confirmation. Lila had tried to tell the truth, and someone had made sure it died quietly, just like her. Eleanor sat alone in the back row of the theater, her shoulders slightly hunched, hands folded in her lap, like a schoolgirl awaiting news she already feared. Jessica approached with quiet care. She sat beside her, waiting until Eleanor spoke first. I always thought my mother was the interloper, Eleanor said, the one who got the part because someone else failed. That's how Charles made it sound. He told me she was lucky, that she should have thanked him for the chance. Jessica looked ahead, toward the stage where half-drawn curtains stirred in the draft. He made a career out of rewriting endings, she said. And people. Eleanor nodded slowly. You think she replaced Lila, don't you? Not just in the role, but in life. Jessica didn't respond directly. Instead, she reached into her handbag and handed Eleanor the locket she had found. Eleanor opened it carefully, her breath caught at the photographs. That's her, she whispered. And him. The silence deepened. Jessica didn't rush it. When I played this role, Eleanor said, eyes brimming, I thought I was channeling my mother, but maybe I've been carrying something else. A legacy, Jessica murmured, or a wound. They sat together in the silence, not of performance but of understanding. Some truths, Jessica knew, were inherited without words. Later that day, Jessica waited near the costume racks, where Vincent Harrow was sorting through garments with unnecessary focus. His fingers tugged too sharply at a sleeve, his jaw clenched with every motion. Vincent, Jessica said gently. He glanced up, guarded. Your full name isn't Harrow, is it? He froze, then slowly straightened. No, he said, with a half laugh. It's Maynard. My adoption papers say Harrow, but my mother, my birth mother, was Lila May. Jessica's expression didn't change. You sent the notes. He nodded, almost defiantly. They weren't threats. I wanted someone to remember. I didn't even know Charles was still alive until this revival. Then I saw him, smiling as if none of it had happened. You confronted him, Jessica said. Yes, I told him I knew what he did, that he ruined her, that he let people call her mad, and no one stopped it. What did he say? Vincent's voice lowered. He said she was weak. That theater devours the soft. Jessica's heart tightened. But you didn't poison him. No. I wanted to expose him. That was enough. Jessica studied him quietly. There was sorrow there, yes, but not malice. Just the weight of a history he had never been allowed to name. "I never knew her," Vincent said softly. "Not really, but I've carried her absence every day." Jessica gave a small nod. Sometimes absence leaves a louder echo than presence ever could. And she now knew Vincent's grief had a voice. But it was not the one that had silenced Charles Avedon. Jessica made her way to the lighting booth, where a technician named Jasper, quiet and observant, kept his own sort of archive. He'd been in the wings the night before Charles died. "Did you see Vincent and Charles speak?" she asked. Jasper looked up from a panel of dimmers. He cornered him near the dressing rooms. "Wasn't loud, but intense." "Did you hear anything?" Jasper hesitated. "Charles said something about clean slates and no more ghosts." Vincent said, "Some ghosts talk back." Then he walked out. Fast, looked shaken, not triumphant. Jessica nodded. "Anything else?" Jasper leaned in. It didn't feel like someone threatening murder. It felt like someone trying not to cry. Jessica let that settle. Later she spoke with a stagehand who had seen Charles exit his room moments before curtain, unusually flushed and distracted. "He kept wiping his mouth like something tasted wrong," the man said. That detail lodged itself in Jessica's mind, a tactile response. Arsenic, bitter and invasive. Charles had noticed, too late. Vincent's confrontation had been real, but his intention had not been fatal. The killer, Jessica now believed, had watched not from the shadows, but from the wings. Close enough to see everything, and close enough to act, not for revenge, but to protect a truth they couldn't bear to let rise. Back in Eleanor's dressing room, Jessica studied the costume hanging neatly on the mannequin. She ran her fingers along the collar, then paused. The inside tag had been replaced, the original stitching still faintly visible beneath the newer thread. LM Jessica drew a breath. The initials had been sewn into the lining long ago. Lila May's costume, altered, refitted, preserved. Had Eleanor unknowingly worn her mother's role, or had someone made sure she would? Jessica turned the costume gently. This wasn't a coincidence. It was symbolic. A tribute, perhaps, or a message. She recalled the locket, the envelope with powder, the note quoting a forgotten line, and now the costume, carefully preserved. It pointed not to an act of rage, but to an act of mourning. Whoever had killed Charles hadn't done so in vengeance. They had done so because his continued silence, his rewriting of the truth, had finally demanded a response. Jessica stood back, the pieces settling into place. The murder hadn't been about a career, it had been about memory. And love, the kind that survives not in photographs or letters, but in stitched initials, hidden messages, and the refusal to forget. The stage was dimly lit, not quite dramatic, but enough to cast long shadows over the floorboards. Jessica sat quietly in the third, notebook closed on her lap, her attention focused not on the script, but on the performers themselves. She had requested a private run-through of Act 2, unofficial, informal. Her reasoning had been simple: the cast needed closure. In truth, she wanted something more subtle, more human, an unguarded moment, a detail unrehearsed. Eleanor stood center stage, speaking lines she had now performed dozens of times. But tonight her voice held a tremor, not from nerves, but from something deeper, a reckoning. Vincent, now reluctantly stepping into a supporting role, remained distant yet composed. Gloria watched from the wings, arms folded, lips drawn tight, and near the edge of the stage stood Ruth Garvey, Eleanor's dresser, holding a costume garment she'd adjusted by hand. She wasn't meant to be part of the rehearsal, but insisted on remaining close, for support, she'd said. Jessica noted how Ruth's eyes never left Eleanor. As the pivotal scene began, the one where the heroine confronts betrayal and memory, Jessica watched carefully, not the actors, but those on the fringes. Ruth gripped the hem of the costume so tightly her knuckles blanched. Her lips moved faintly, echoing Eleanor's lines under her breath. Then, just before the monologue's emotional climax, Eleanor faltered, not dramatically but with a noticeable catch. Jessica noticed Ruth's reaction immediately. Her hand trembled, and her body shifted as though absorbing a blow. It was not a stage reaction, it was recognition. Jessica's instincts stirred, not in triumph, but in quiet, painful certainty. Something in this moment had pierced Ruth's silence, and now Jessica had only to draw the truth from behind the curtain of grief. When the rehearsal ended, applause was scattered and solemn. The cast broke apart slowly, tension still clinging to their shoulders. Jessica remained seated, waiting for the room to empty. She watched Ruth linger by the curtain ropes, her eyes distant. Jessica stood and approached with a measured calm. "You knew that line," she said gently. Ruth turned. Her face didn't register surprise, only fatigue. "Which line?" "Even silence echoes when the heart can't forget." "You mouthed it, but that line was removed from the final script decades ago." Ruth looked away. "I helped Lila rehearse. I knew them all." Jessica let the silence stretch, long and unhurried. "Charles Avedon died from arsenic poisoning," she said softly. "Delivered in a lozenge only someone familiar with his habits could have prepared. Someone who knew he'd never skip his ritual." Ruth's fingers tightened around the hem of the costume in her hands. "I didn't want him to die like that," she whispered. "But you planned it," Jessica said, her voice without accusation, only understanding. Ruth swallowed hard. "He destroyed her, not just her role, but her life. He made her into a ghost, and then cursed anyone who remembered." Jessica nodded slowly. "And when he threatened to do the same to Eleanor, I couldn't let it happen again." Jessica's eyes softened. "You've carried this for so long." Ruth blinked rapidly. "Grief doesn't get lighter, Jessica. It just changes its costume." Jessica said nothing. The truth had finally stepped out into the light, but the curtain had not yet closed. They sat in the old green room, its furniture faded, its walls lined with curling posters from long-ago performances. "Soul Pulse." Ruth held the locket in her hands, the one Jessica had recovered, and turned it over with trembling fingers. "I gave that to her," she said quietly. On the day she was cast, Jessica watched as Ruth opened it and stared at the two miniature faces. "Did you know," she asked, "about the child?" Ruth nodded, eyes glistening. She was scared. It was never about fame. She wanted love, a place to belong. But when Charles realized she was pregnant, he panicked, told her the show couldn't carry that weight. He began rewriting the script, then rewriting her. "And Elizabeth Moore?" Jessica asked gently. "Leela begged Charles to let her understudy perform. At least let her finish the play if I can't," she said. And then she disappeared. Jessica's voice was steady. "You believe he had something to do with it?" Ruth's voice dropped. "I don't believe I know." She stared down at the locket. "She came to me the night before, said she was going to confront him. Not just about the role, but about the baby. She never returned." Jessica felt a cold certainty settle. "You never told anyone?" Ruth shook her head. "Who would listen?" Charles controlled the narrative. Even Gloria kept silent. He said it would ruin the theater. So I stayed. sewed seams, powdered noses, waited, and when Eleanor was cast, she didn't know, but she walked like her. Her voice had the same music. I saw the past being erased again. Jessica let the silence linger. I didn't want vengeance, Ruth whispered. I wanted to stop the silence. Jessica stood slowly. It was premeditated, Ruth, but not born of hate. Ruth's eyes lifted. Then what was it? Jessica paused. A heartbreak with nowhere else to go. Outside voices drifted. The company preparing for a final run. Life moving forward, even as truths waited backstage. Jessica looked to Ruth once more. It's time. Ruth smoothed the folds of her skirt, and placed the locket back into Jessica's palm. Let them remember her, she said, and stepped into the light. Jessica remained in the green room after Ruth had spoken, the quiet settling like dust after a long-forgotten curtain call. Across from her, Ruth sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze somewhere beyond the peeling edges of old posters. There was no triumph in the air, only stillness, the kind that comes when a truth too long buried has finally surfaced. Jessica broke the silence softly. You've given Eleanor more than you realize. Ruth looked at her, puzzled. How? You spared her from a second betrayal. From living her life unknowingly echoing the fate of a woman she never met. Ruth's voice was brittle. I didn't want her to find out this way. Or ever. Jessica nodded. But secrets like this, they find their way through the cracks. Through seams, and scripts, and silent gestures. She reached across the space between them, her hand resting gently atop Ruth's. I understand why you did what you did, Ruth. I don't condone it. But I understand. A single tear slipped down Ruth's cheek. Will they arrest me? Jessica didn't answer immediately. Yes, she said at last. They must. But that's not the end of the story. You didn't kill out of hatred or greed. You killed because you couldn't bear the silence any longer. Ruth closed her eyes. And now that silence is mine. Jessica stood. No, Ruth. Now that silence belongs to history. And history she knew would never again forget Lila May. Before calling the authorities, Jessica led Ruth through the darkened theater one last time. They moved slowly, without hurry, as though walking a sacred procession through memory. The building had emptied for the evening, save for the quiet echo of footsteps and the occasional groan of the old boards settling beneath time. They stopped near the wings. Jessica gave Ruth space. Ruth approached the edge of the stage, her hand trailing across the proscenium arch, her eyes lingering on the sullen curtain that had once marked both entrance and erasure. She stepped lightly onto the stage, not with the grace of a performer, but the reverence of someone who had kept the machinery of illusion running for decades. I used to sit right there, she said, pointing to a small, unremarkable corner, sewing hems, watching Lila rehearse, whispering lines back when she forgot them. Jessica remained near, a respectful distance between them. She always paused before her first line, Ruth added softly. Just a breath, like she needed to pull something up from inside. Jessica nodded, listening. Ruth turned to her. Promise me someone will remember her, not as the woman who vanished, but as the woman who tried. Jessica held her gaze. I promise. Ruth stepped down, her final movement, elegant in its simplicity. As they reached the theater's front doors, Ruth turned back once, eyes searching the empty seats. Goodbye, Lila, she whispered, and in the hush that followed, Jessica could almost hear a response, soft, distant, but unmistakably there. The Belmore Theatre looked different that evening. There was no visible change in the grand archway, no alteration in the lighting or velvet seats. but something had shifted. A hush had settled, not the usual anticipatory silence of opening night, but something deeper, more reverent. Jessica took her seat in the middle row, quietly declining the offer to sit in the reserved section. She preferred a view less adorned, closer to the human drama than the prestige of it. She glanced toward the stage, where the red curtain shimmered softly under the overhead lights, the same curtain that had once hidden so many truths. Tonight's program bore a dedication to Lila May, whose voice now speaks once more. Below it, a small photograph of the young actress smiled shyly, surrounded by a simple border of orchids. The house lights dimmed. As the overture began, Jessica allowed herself a long breath. The music was unchanged, but the weight of it had transformed. This was no longer merely a revival, it was a resurrection. Eleanor stepped into the spotlight, her silhouette familiar, yet newly formed. Her first line was spoken not as imitation or performance, but as invocation. There was no theatrical flourish, no reaching. It came from somewhere quiet and rooted, from a lineage not learned, but lived. Jessica observed with quiet admiration. Eleanor moved with both grace and gravitas. The character's sorrow was no longer stylized, it was real, layered, felt. The audience leaned forward, drawn not by spectacle, but by sincerity. Tonight, Jessica thought, the play would not be rewritten, it would be reclaimed. And somewhere in the folds of the curtain and the soft breath between scenes, a voice long silenced was finally being heard. The performance unfolded like the peeling of a long-closed letter, each line revealing not just the script, but the soul behind it. Jessica watched as Eleanor's voice deepened in timbre, not from strain, but from ownership. Each pause carried the weight of someone who now understood the lines, not just intellectually, but ancestrally. There was a scene mid-act, once cut, now restored, where the protagonist recounts a love lost to silence. Jessica had read it in the original draft, a passage Lila May had once fought to keep. Tonight, Eleanor spoke it word for word. Some truths were never written, some were scratched into the floorboards, whispered into mirrors, folded into sleeves. A ripple went through the audience, that shift when performance becomes presence. Jessica saw Ruth's empty chair in the shadows near the exit. She'd asked not to attend. "I've already lived it," she had said. But her absence was felt, as meaningful as her presence had been. There was no applause at intermission, not out of disinterest, but reverence. The audience remained seated, hushed, unwilling to break the thread. Jessica reflected on how the murder, though tragic, had unlocked a truth far more enduring than vengeance. The theatre, once home to erasure and ego, had become a chapel of remembrance. Eleanor took her final bow with tears, not of exhaustion, but recognition. And in that moment Jessica thought, this was the kind of justice no court could deliver, only the stage. After the final curtain fell, and the applause gave way to a soft exhale of emotion, Jessica remained in her seat, the red program still clutched in her lap. The audience had begun to rise, coats gathered, conversations hushed with reflection, but Jessica sat still, eyes focused not on the departing crowd, but on the red curtain, drawn once more. It hung not as a barrier, but as a boundary, a veil between what had been performed and what had been lived, between illusion and memory, between what we choose to say and what we leave behind in silence. She'd always believed the theatre was more than artifice. It was a place where people wore masks to reveal their truest selves. That belief had never felt more true. The red curtain no longer seemed ominous to her. It was just fabric now, beautifully aged, gently swaying in the theatre's old breath. She thought of Lila May, of Ruth, of Eleanor, and even of Charles Avedon, flawed and frightened by the very truth he tried to bury. The curtain had hidden his sins, but it had also held the story safe, until someone brave enough pulled it aside. Jessica touched the spine of her notebook with one hand. There were still questions that wouldn't be answered, motivations left murky, emotions unreconciled. But some endings weren't about perfect resolution, some were about remembering. Back at her hotel, Jessica sat near the window, city lights twinkling like scattered applause beyond the glass. Her notebook lay open before her, a page half filled with thoughtful lines and half-finished sentences. She tapped her pen lightly against the paper, then began to write, slowly, with the precision that always followed emotional clarity. In every tragedy, there is a hidden author, someone who shapes the silence as much as the words. Sometimes, they are the ones who speak the least. Sometimes, they vanish before the final act, but their influence lingers, written not in ink, but in shadow and memory. She paused, letting the words settle. Tonight, a voice returned. Not loudly, but completely, not through vengeance, but through performance. It reminded us that justice is not always a verdict. Sometimes, it is simply the act of being heard. Jessica closed the notebook and folded her hands around a warm teacup beside her. The locket lay on the table nearby, its clasp repaired, its presence humble but steady. A gentle wind pressed against the window pane, carrying the sounds of the street below. Laughter, footsteps, the rustle of late-night theater-goers still discussing what they'd seen. She let it wash over her. Lila May's story had not ended with her death. It had waited, and now, in the quiet power of performance and memory, it had found its final audience. Jessica reached for the lamp and turned down the light. The curtain had fallen, but the echo remained. Some curtains fall with thunderous applause, others with a silence that lingers long after the final bow. But tell me, was Ruth seeking justice, or simply trying to rewrite a tragedy no one else dared to face? I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you believe truly drove her to act? Share your theory in the comments below. And if you enjoyed walking through the shadows with me, do pass this story along to a friend. Tap the like and subscribe for more mysteries where every whisper might hold the final clue.